Hello, everyone. Thanks for the intro. So again, my name is Julia. I've been an iOS developer for about 6 years now. And for the past year, I've worked with a research lab to build experimental prototypes. And the one that I want to talk about today is called Muse, the most recent project that I've been working on. And it's a prototype app for the iPad and for the Apple Pencil. And we built it with a team of 3. We had one designer, one product/vision owner, and me as the engineer. And with this app, we're really trying out some rather radical user interface ideas. So we're trying to challenge a little bit the status quo of how most apps work. And so what you hear in the next half hour, you might find it interesting or inspiring, hopefully. It might also make you angry, especially if you feel like the human interface guidelines that Apple gives us are more like a Bible than maybe a friendly set of suggestions, because we're definitely breaking a lot of those. So very curious to exchange ideas with you afterwards if any of our ideas resonate with you or if you think that what we're doing is total nonsense. So to give you a bit of an outline, I'm first going to talk about what the app is, what it's for, like who it's for. I'm going to give you a little demo, of course. Then I'm going to explain some of the design thinking and the design principles that went into building this. Then we're going to do a little deep dive on one of the technical aspects, technical challenges in building this. And I will wrap up with a bit of a personal takeaway and give an outlook into the future for this. So Muse is an app that lets you collect all types of raw material and arrange it in a visual way and then kind of add your own thoughts to it. And we often like to call it a thinking canvas or a studio for ideas. And that is based on the observation that creative people often work in a multi-step process. So good ideas don't usually just fall from the sky. They take a lot of time to be developed, and often gradually over the course of years. And they often involve a process where you first collect a bunch of input, like a lot of raw material and inspiration. You arrange them somehow, and then in a second step, you review all of that. You kind of sort through it. You filter out some key information. You add your own thoughts to it. You form connections between things. And then based on that, maybe you will end up developing your own ideas or coming up with a plan for something that you want to do. So we really wanted to build an app that helps people with that kind of workflow to work very efficiently and creatively. And I'm going to give you a little demo now and show you how it works. In fact, surprise, you're already inside the demo, because I'm also giving my entire talk and my entire slides in this tool, even though it's not necessarily a presentation tool, but I figured it would be more fun for everyone and a lot more terrifying for me to do this. So let me take you to a space that's a bit more of a real-world example. So here you see a little kitchen remodeling project, and there's already a lot of content in here. So the view that you see here, we call a board. And a board is filled with cards that represent all the content you have in there. And you can navigate into these cards based on zooming. So there's a pinch gesture that you can use to zoom in. You can also zoom into other boards. So we currently support 4 media types. Images, obviously. Then we have these text cards here. We support PDFs very heavily, and web content as well. And so once you have a little bit of content on your board, you can kind of move things around and resize items and basically curate your board any way that you would want it to look like. And to do that, you use your Apple Pencil. So we actually made the pencil a requirement for this app to work, which is obviously a bit of a controversial decision because it's a pretty expensive piece of hardware. It only works with the latest generation iPads, so by default, you'll be excluding a lot of people from being able to use this. But since we're a research lab and we're doing some weird prototyping stuff, we explicitly wanted to explore what a stylus-driven interface could look and feel like. So we made the stylus a requirement. And so the stylus is used to manipulate content on your board, and the fingers are for navigation. And in fact, I'm going to activate a little debug feature here. Did it work? Yeah. So if you see a blue dot moving on the screen, that's my fingers. And if you see a smaller dot, that's the stylus moving on the screen. So you can follow me around a little bit better now. So boards can be nested up to a certain, infinite level deep, basically. So you can kind of think of them as folders, and the cards in your boards would be the files. And you can work with these files just like in a normal file system. You can do things like deleting items by picking them up with your stylus and then just throwing them off the edge of your screen. And you can do things like copying things, for example, by holding down a finger on that item and then dragging it out with your stylus. You're basically dragging out a duplicate of that, and you just drop it. And we try to, as much as possible, make these actions like the primitive building blocks of the interface that you can combine in any way you like. So you can, if you're like dragging out a duplicate and then in the middle of that you decide you actually don't want that, you can just throw it, you can just throw it off the edge of the screen like that. And you can even combine these action gestures with navigation gestures. So I can do things like pick up a card here, then I move out of that board, maybe into a completely different space, and then drop the card there. This is all one fluid, continuous gesture. So in addition to containers for your content, boards are also free-form canvases for drawing and inking. So I can take my stylus and just write something on here. And in fact, all of the content on your board works like that. So I can pinch into this image, and I can draw something here, or annotate measurements or something like that. For PDFs, this is maybe a little bit more useful if you're reading long PDFs and you kind of want to highlight things that are maybe important to you or that you don't understand. And another thing that you can do with PDFs is that you can create excerpts from them for things that you care about enough that you want to keep them separately. So I can, for example, here select this bit of text, and that will create a new text card. Or I can even like take entire snippets like arbitrarily from the PDF, for example, an image like that, and that will create a new image card. This little check mark indicates that it's done. And those new cards will appear in my shelf. So the shelf is another concept we introduced. It's sort of a transient space. You can pull it up from the bottom at any time. And it's sort of a scratch pad, like your desktop maybe on your computer. You can use it as a visual copy-paste buffer, so you can pull a bunch of cards in there and then go somewhere else and pull them out again. But it also behaves just like any other board. So you can draw on it, you can bring cards full screen. You can also use it as a kind of split screen, for example. If I'm like reading a long PDF and I want to keep my own notes as I go, I could like write on here while I read up here. So there's a couple different uses for the shelf. And another thing that I wanted to show you, remember these excerpts that I just took? Let me drop them here. So the cool thing about excerpts is that they actually retain a link back to their source document. And we call this mechanic a wormhole. It's indicated by this little black dot. And it's called a wormhole because it lets you travel through space. So when I hold my finger down here now, we're going to be taken through the wormhole back to the source document where I took it from and actually have the text selection highlighted where it came from. So this could, for example, be useful if you're working on a thesis and you're reading a lot of PDFs and you're pulling out some content and you need to be able to go back to that later to put it into your references and like know where it's coming from. That's kind of a useful mechanic for this more academic type work that we want to support as well. So yeah, this is kind of the core functionality that we have at the moment. Of course, I skipped over a few things that are maybe less interesting, like how to get data in and out. Those were also not really the focus of this prototype. But of course, we had some specific design goals and design principles that we applied to building this, and I want to walk you through some of them now. Let's go back to these slides. So we chose this whole spatial, free-form, mixed media type approach because we think that it's a lot more in line with how humans tend to think. So we are very inspired here by physical spaces such as desks or drafting tables, whiteboards, pinboards. These are all very informal, personal spaces where you can kind of get messy and really interact with the things on them. So you can put things front and center that are very important to you. You can put the less important things further away. You can cluster items that belong together. You can draw connections on them, like a crazy detective board maybe. So we think that this kind of flexibility is a lot more stimulating for the mind and for creativity than like neatly ordered lists and grids, maybe sorted by name or by date, like your file system probably works, or most productivity tools that are on the market today. So we didn't like that, so we tried to come up with something slightly different here. The other thing that you might have noticed is that except for the actual content in the app, there's no additional Chrome surrounding that content, so no menus, toolbars, buttons anywhere around that. And that was also a conscious design decision because we really wanted to create this blank, calm, inviting space where it's like a completely blank page that is inviting for you to fill with your content without any visual distractions. Another thing that we wanted to do is to kind of explore and sort of push the boundaries of like a fully gesture-driven UI. We have these amazing tablets that are so capable of processing multi-touch, but a lot of apps don't really leverage that. And so specifically making the stylus a distinct input device that's different from your finger opened up a lot of possibilities here. So I think we can all agree that like just throwing a card off the edge of the screen is a lot faster and also a lot more fun than doing it like normal apps do it, where you maybe do long press on an item, and then you wait a little bit and it pops up a context menu, and then you select an action, and then finally something happens. So we wanted to do something a little bit more free-form and fun. And in particular, we wanted to explore the implications of a modeless interface. So a modeless interface is an interface where the result of an action does not depend on any state that isn't the immediate focus of the user's attention. So this is, I think, actually better explained with a counterexample. If we take this app here, Paper by 53, one of my favorite early iPad apps, you can draw a lot of things and then say you want to erase something. You actually have to like go to the toolbar, activate the eraser, and then you can start erasing from your drawing. So you have to switch your focus away from your drawing, and you also have to be always aware which mode you're currently in. So if you're maybe distracted for a minute with something else, and then you come back to your drawing, you start drawing and maybe forgot that the eraser was activated. So lots of errors can happen that way. That's generally the problem with mode-based interfaces. So a modeless interface would do things a little bit differently. So actions would be invoked in different ways. So in Muse, for example, if you hold your stylus like this and you just start drawing something, it will immediately draw ink, no matter, like you don't have to first activate a mode or something. And if you want to erase, you do the same thing, but at the same time you hold a finger on the screen somewhere. So it doesn't actually have to be next to the drawing, it could be up here or here. And that activates the eraser, and then I can just erase right away. So it really works more kind of like a modifier key, maybe holding down a shift key on your keyboard invokes a slightly different action, but you're not actually going back and forth between different modes in this way. Thank you. Unexpected. Good opportunity for a sip of water. So there's a lot of interesting research on modeless interfaces. They take a little bit more time getting used to, of course. But the big upside is that once you have internalized the entire command vocabulary of an app, you can really use it very fast and efficiently. So you can basically use your muscle memory to do things without having to think about them all the time. So it's really kind of a good mechanic for pro users that really like to invest in learning their tools to be able to use them really efficiently. But so for Muse, this pencil, as you already saw, is not just for drawing and erasing, but also for moving and resizing cards. So we had to come up with yet another mechanic to distinguish between those two things. And we went through a bunch of different iterations here and often ended up with something that was more toggle mode-based again, and we didn't like that. So what we came up with eventually was something slightly surprising and maybe a little bit weird, but bear with me, and that is to actually hold your stylus in two different ways. So if you hold it normally, like a pencil that you would draw with, you draw ink or you erase, depending on your finger or not. And if you want to move or resize a card, you actually hold it with a low angle towards the screen. So you know the system can detect the angle of the stylus. So you could, for example, hold it like this, just completely switch your grip. I personally usually just kind of tilt it to the side and hold it more like a chopstick. So different people have different preferences here, but the general idea is that you use one and the same items, like two different tools. Kind of like a normal pencil often has an eraser at the end, which is actually something I wish Apple would have done for their pencil. Some other styluses have that. Or at least maybe like a modifier button that you could hold down and that would give you a different input event. That would have been great. Maybe they'll do that in the future, who knows. But until then, we have to kind of come up with these rather quirky hacks to turn one tool into multiple different ones. So, of course, I also want to talk a little bit about the challenges that went into building all this. And there's a lot of different things I could talk about, but I want to focus on one in particular, and that is also kind of one of the trickiest ones, and one that I'm still actively working on, which is how to implement this seamless, continuous zooming interface. So under the hood, this is actually all wrapped in a navigation controller, just hiding the navigation bar. And as I zoom in and out of places, I'm actually just pushing and popping new view controllers to the stack. And if you implement the UI navigation controller delegate, you can return an object that conforms to UI view controller animated transitioning. And that way you can fully customize how these push and pop transitions are supposed to look. So we can take this apart a little bit. Let's say that I'm going to zoom into this little thing. And there's a few different things that are happening during the transition. So the parent board has to scale it has to adapt its scale and also translate its position to center on the card. And then there's a few other things that are happening, like the sibling cards are fading out, the ink on the parent card also fades out, the background color slightly changes, so that's all part of the animation. But there are a few other things that I had to tweak or pay attention to really get this to work smoothly. For example, you have to make sure that the card that represents the board that you're going to is really a perfectly identical version of what that board would look like in full screen. Because, I mean, at this point, we're still just operating on the parent board. But at some point, when I'm letting go, the transition actually finishes, and we switch to the next view controller. So if there were only some slight differences in like the positioning or maybe even just the resolution of the image, then you would see these weird jumps or artifacts, and then that would completely break this illusion of like a seamless, continuous space that we're trying to go for. So that was one thing. The other thing that we really cared about is that this interface responds immediately to your pinch gesture and to have like a very smooth zooming experience throughout. And the problem with that is that boards can actually be quite expensive to render. Maybe this one not so much, but if we go, for example, back to this kitchen board, there's a lot of stuff going on here. And like loading and drawing all of that view can just take a little bit of time to finish. And if you would do that like you normally would in your view.load method, then that would be called directly at the beginning of the transition when you first trigger it. So that would mean that in the beginning of my pinch, I would basically drop a couple frames and then end up with this kind of choppy jump that we wanted to avoid. So what I did here to avoid this, I'm actually going to turn on a little feature here, which is our frames per seconds counter. We borrowed this from the gaming industry, where it's kind of an industry standard, because we cared a lot about the performance of the app and this like smooth experience, so we use this to identify bottlenecks and see how we can work around them. So you can see that I actually deferred the whole construction of the new view controller that you're going to the view.appear method of that view controller, and that only gets called at the end when the transition finishes. So let's say we go here to the kitchen board. You see the frame rate stays pretty constantly high because we're really just doing some light scaling and stuff. But once I let go, it drops briefly because now at this point the board actually gets re-rendered in the new view controller. But this is kind of a good point in time to do that because at that time the user has just lifted their fingers from the transition, and it's relatively unlikely that like in the next 50 milliseconds they'll go and like start wildly editing the board again. So these are kind of some hacks in how we can work around and like defer the expensive work to good points in time. I'm going to turn this off again. So the other thing that was kind of tricky to get right was how to render these board cards in the first place. So the first kind of naive approach that I took here was to just render the entire hierarchy of your content onto the screen all at once. But that pretty quickly led to memory issues and to crashes, of course, because remember that boards can contain other boards, and so on. So if you're trying to like load all of that content recursively and then transform it and draw it on the screen all at once, you're pretty likely to bring the system down to its knees quite quickly, especially if you have like lots of large-scale images or PDF content that's rendered in these little collection views. And if you have very complex nesting, you're basically setting yourself up for problems. So I abandoned this whole approach pretty early on and instead implemented something that we call board snapshotting. And the way that this works is that boards that represent other boards in the cards, they don't actually render their whole UI view hierarchy, but instead basically just display like a screenshot of what that board last looked like. So it's just a flat image. It's a lot easier to render for the GPU, of course. And the best part is that there's an easy way to do that. If you just like write a little extension on top of UI view, these 3 lines of code will draw the entire view hierarchy into an image and return it to you. So that's great, we think. But of course, now you have to make sure that you always keep these snapshots up to date. So if I do something like draw something on here and move something around, and then I zoom out, I need to make sure that the card that represents that board is already updated in time to reflect those changes. And in fact, not only that card, but also all the other cards, because you can kind of see, even if you can't see it very well, but you have to propagate these changes all the way up to the highest parent. And so the problem with that is that the snapshot, actually like rendering a full screen UI view on an iPad resolution, actually can take quite some time to process. So like these 3 lines of code for a very complex board, like the kitchen board that we saw, can take maybe a couple 100 milliseconds to complete, which is often why when you take a screenshot on your phone, you see a kind of delay, and then it actually flashes up. It just takes a while. And so because this method here is based on UIKit, that means for the duration of execution of that snapshotting, our entire interface remains unresponsive, which is, of course, a big problem if you have like a highly gesture-driven app like this one. So I tried a few different things around this, like scheduling a timer that would fire maybe 100 milliseconds after the last interaction, after the last modification, and only trigger the snapshotting if at that point in time you don't have a stylus or a finger touching the screen, so that we don't like steal your gesture, basically. But even then, we would run into problems like this one. For example, if you consider like I'm drawing something on the screen here, I'm lifting my stylus, at that point the timer gets scheduled, then let's say 100 milliseconds later it fires, and I check is there a finger or a stylus currently on the screen? No, there's not, great, so we can trigger the snapshot. But then 50 milliseconds later, here, my stylus actually goes down again and wants to draw something, but at that point the snapshot is already going on, and there's no way to kind of cancel it in between. So for the next 150 milliseconds, my stylus movements won't be processed, and I end up with a kind of really weird inking experience where like it would constantly lag behind and create some like weird-looking strokes. So that was kind of a showstopper for us, and the only viable thing that I really could think of to do was to defer all of this to the background thread. But of course, again, this is based on UIKit, so then you can't use this like nifty little 3-line piece of code because that has to be run on the main thread. So what I ended up doing is to basically write a custom board renderer that draws the entire hierarchy of a board into an image context using core graphics. And gladly, a lot of the stuff on the boards is already representable through images, like the ink, the images themselves, of course. The boards, as we just learned, are just snapshot images. So really, most of the work that I had to do was to kind of build another version of the text card that uses core text instead of like UI labels and text views and stuff, and to like rebuild the PDF, like the little PDF collection view. So it was actually not quite that much work. And I eventually ended up with something that I could run on the background thread, completely independent from what's going on the screen. And I finally had this like continuous smooth zooming and continuously responsive interface that we were going for. But of course, like everything, this also came with a few new downsides. The most obvious one, I think, is now that you have to maintain 2 different places of like how a card is represented. So if you want to add a new card type in the future, you have to add it both in the like UIKit-based like gesture recognizer land and also in the static board renderer. So it's not very nice maintainable for the future. And then the other thing is that we still sometimes have cases where the snapshots aren't actually ready in time for when you need them to be ready. So if you zoom out very shortly after you made a modification, the background snapshot might not be done in time, because now you're running in the background, you're using shared resources, so it could actually take a little longer even to render. So I'm going to activate the little frames counter again for you to demonstrate this. So if I move some cards around here, maybe draw something on the screen, and then zoom out right away, we have to basically force render the snapshot on, like using this UIKit-based function. to make sure that the card is ready and ready to be updated in time for the Zoom transition to start. So these are still some things where we're seeing some problems. We left this for a while to be able to move on to other things that we wanted to explore. But I actually, recently, this is still something that I'm actively working on. I recently took a little spike to explore some alternatives here. One idea would be to not actually separate the different zoom level into different view controllers, like I explained I'm doing, but to instead kind of render one continuous space, but only render it up to a certain level deep. So you wouldn't go down all the way to the hierarchy, but only render maybe the most direct children, and then represent the smaller boards in some other way. And then as you zoom through that space, you basically just update the visibility of all the leaf nodes of your tree structure, essentially. So that might be one way going forward. Another thing that I looked at is texture. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. It used to be called Async Display Kit. This came out of Facebook, and now I think Instagram is actually, not Instagram, Pinterest is actually using this. And it's basically a library that sits on top of UIKit, and it lets you configure and lay out entire view hierarchies asynchronously. So I did some initial experiments with this. It's really more focused towards apps that have long scrolling lists of things where they need to pre-fetch a lot of content and pre-configure it, and they want to make sure to have a better frame rate when you scroll. Not yet entirely convinced it's the right fit for our weird zooming interface thing that we're trying to do, but I'm still looking into this. So this is still something I'm actively pondering, trying to figure out the right architecture for this going forward to have a solid foundation, because what happened now after the initial prototyping phase is that we gave this to a bunch of test users, and they really, really liked it. Some of them are still using it. We also published an article about this that resonated quite well in the industry. So we actually think that we have something that's kind of promising enough to maybe turn this into a commercial product on the App Store. So 2 of the core members of that research lab and me were actually in the middle of trying to found a company now and to really make this happen, as a spin-off of this lab work. So now, of course, we're sitting on this pile of code that's kind of poorly architected. It was only supposed to be a prototype. Lots of features were built kind of ad hoc. We threw a lot of things out. We were just piling things on top of each other and moved very, very fast. But apart from a few bugs, of course, the app is actually working quite well, and some people are using it in their daily lives. So the question is, where do you go from there? I think every engineer, at least once in their career, has been at a point where they feel wouldn't it be so much better if we could throw everything away and just rewrite everything from scratch? And I think a big part of this is that it's a lot more fun to write code than to read code. It's also a lot easier to write your own stuff than to work with someone else's stuff. And especially once a code base becomes relatively complex, it becomes harder and harder to build on top of it often. But in reality, it's really rarely a good idea to completely throw something away, because a lot of brain power already went into building it, and often it's also just not viable from a budget perspective. So in our case, we have a relatively bootstrapped budget to try to make this happen, and of course we want to get to real users as fast as possible and to take their feedback and improve the app that we already have. So instead of now sitting down for a couple of months rewriting all of this, I'm now kind of splitting my time between, on one hand, working on new features, and on the other hand, also refactoring the core architecture, making it more robust, making it a bit more scalable, also easier to read in case we want to take on another developer maybe in the mid to near future. So the team is, of course, aware that the code is still a little bit of a mess, and they're not expecting things to move quite as fast anymore as in the prototyping phase, where it was basically cranking out a new feature every day. So it's really a bit of a shift of a mindset that needs to happen now for everyone to make this code base more mature and kind of try to go from this weird, messy prototype into an actual product that we can give to people. So overall, I think the conclusion for me here is that you can't always anticipate what's going to be the most challenging part of building something, neither engineering-wise nor in the design land. So if you're really just trying out some wild ideas and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't, I think there's a lot of value in this approach of rapid prototyping and just building something quick and dirty and then evaluating if it works or if your idea is even possible. instead of like locking yourself up in a dark corner for 4 months and trying to come up with the best, most elegant architecture, only then to realize that your idea sucks and that you have to do something else. So, of course, some things have to be built right from the very beginning. But I would really encourage you to try to identify situations where it makes sense to like build something really fast. Don't worry about making it perfect. See if you like it. If you don't, you can throw it away. If you do, maybe you hate yourself a little bit for having built it the way you built it, but then you can go back and clean up after yourself and make it better and robust for the future. That's it from me. Thanks very much for your attention. Would love to chat. I think we have time for some questions. If you're interested in knowing more about this, you can follow the Ink and Switch Twitter. That's the research lab I worked for. If you want to read the article, very long article that we published about all of these design ideas that we tried out, you can do that, or talk to me tonight if you want to try the app out, maybe as a beta user. And yeah, thanks so much. Any questions? Yeah, I see someone there.
Hi. Ooh. Over here.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Awesome presentation. Question I had is, sometimes the kind of exploratory design work relies on a product having exploratory designs, like, you know, experimental transitions and kind of things that you don't build day to day, or, you know, non-default behaviors.
Yeah.
Besides kind of like researching interesting products and stealing ideas and seeing how they're implemented, like, how do you suggest that iOS engineers kind of explore more custom and unique ways to design gestures and transitions and interfaces?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and it's part of why I joined this research lab, because I feel like it was really like an opportunity to work on something more explorative. I think there's, you know, so much talk about this is the way you should do things, like, you know, the Apple Human Interface Guidelines tell us to do things a certain way. And yeah, we kind of tried to, on purpose, break those patterns a little bit. And, you know, it stands to debate whether or not that's a good idea, but I think just kind of trying to go against the grain a little bit in some cases, and like, if you have a weird idea of something that maybe you don't know if it's going to work out, just go and try to build it and see if it's even possible, and if it makes sense. Test it with people. Yeah.
Wow. Where do I sign? Actually, my question is regarding the limiting the input just to Stylus. Do you think maybe it's not a problem regarding the interface guideline, human interface guideline, but do you expect having problems going through the App Store review?
That is a good question. We haven't actually thought about that yet. When we first, a little side story regarding this, when we first published the test build to test flight, if you want to give it to external people, it has to go through review. And remember how I mentioned earlier that, like, aside from your content, the app is like a completely blank canvas. Our build initially got rejected because Apple said only displays blank screen. So I am very much expecting to be running up against rejections from the App Store because we're doing things in such a different way. So we'll see if the Stylus itself is going to be a problem. I don't know. Hopefully not. I mean, they built this like really sophisticated piece of hardware, and really, except for a couple nice drawing apps, no one really leverages that. So I would hope that they actually encourage developers to like experiment more with stylus-driven interfaces in the future.
Idea is amazing. Yep.
Thank you.
Hi. Regarding the previous question, for that you have review notes to Apple. Say, this is a blank canvas. Use this and this. But it's a great app. I really would love to use it. Yesterday, I know many design teams that think in the same way that your app works. So I think it will be a huge success. And when do I sign up, indeed?
Thank you. The other.
Hi. First of all, fantastic presentation.
Oh, yeah.
Right here. Congratulations. I was wondering if it's been a challenge for you to onboard new users, and if so, how did you handle that?
Yeah, so we're right now on a very tightly handled beta program, and we onboard every user personally or through video chat. So, like, obviously, as you saw, this is not a self-explanatory interface. So we actually get people on a call, we get them to download the build, we make sure they have all the hardware that they need, and then we show them how we use the app and what they can do with it, like very similar to the demo that I gave you now, and then we'll let them use it and ask them if they get any value out of it after a while.
Hi, this fantastic presentation and the great app. I'm already in love with it.
Thanks.
So my question is, did you run into any memory consumption issues during development?
Yes, definitely. And a lot of them are still not addressed. Like, as I said, we're kind of moving out of the scrappy prototyping phase. The one that I mentioned, like in the middle of the talk, where trying to like just render everything recursively, that was like setting ourselves up for crashes. And so that's definitely one issue. Like, but as the app grows and potentially the user's content and the whole corpus in there grows, we're going to have to look into kind of caching things and only really fetching the things that are very close to you that you might get to maybe with one pinch, and then releasing documents that you most likely won't get to so quickly. So yeah, that's something that is on the back of our minds and that I'll have to address soon, but it's a prototype,
So yeah, thanks for presenting this amazing app, Julia. I want to ask is that how do you plan to arrange this big data? So for example, if I have a lot of designs at the end, I would like to search, have a search idea to find what I drew, or maybe sort them based on date of creation or location where we do. Is there any plan like this?
So this is a good question, something that we haven't completely thought through. Like one thing, so I think this like spatial arrangement of things, first of all, helps you remember a lot better where you put things, because you consciously put it in a certain position. But we're also, for example, thinking of other types of collections. For example, just having like stacks of items where you can flip through them. And then search is obviously also still an open question. Like currently, different to a file system where the files have names and stuff, where you can actually like use a search bar to search them. Here, the items are basically just like visually represented, so searching them will be interesting. So we might look into something like you can label or tag or name things if you want them to be more searchable. But yeah, that's definitely like a whole area that we haven't really gone deeply into.
Hey, app looks amazing. I was wondering, how do you balance wanting to make innovative gestures with making gestures that are discoverable by users? Because obviously, like the person by person setup is not necessarily something that's going to scale super amazingly, but it's, how do you balance that?
Yeah, I think in the long term, we're going to have to do some sort of tutorial thing. So when you first open the app, maybe you see a completely blank canvas, maybe there's already one or two things in there, and then the app is like, use your stylus at this, like hold it like this to move stuff around. Like, I'm generally not too much of a fan of tutorials that like really take you by the hand and like force you to do things, but I think we can hopefully come up with ways to make that like not annoying and still teach you how to use the interface.
Thank you.
Wow.
Lots of questions. This is probably the last thing you want to hear, but are you worried about patenting and patent issues? Like, I worked on a very similar approach to interaction 5 years ago, and I know they tried to patent these interactions and this kind of approach. Just something to think about. And then, did you try something like CA tiled layer kind of rendering when you were talking about like rendering the whole thing together? Yeah. That's where we kind of ended up following similar issues. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if you prototyped with something like a scroll view, kind of rendering everything in a CA tiled layer infrastructure.
So to the first question, actually interesting point. I don't think we've thought about that patenting issue at all. Hopefully we won't have to, but good point. And to the second question, sounds very interesting. Would love to talk to you more about if you have ideas. I think it was like part of the intention also presenting this like challenging interface at a conference like this is that I'm actually like, this is where we're at now. There's still work to be done, and I would like love to exchange ideas with people on how to make this scalable. So, C.A. Tyler, you said? Yeah. No, we haven't looked into that yet. Anyone else? Yes? One more, two more. Yeah? I mean, yeah, it's, I guess.
Hello? Hi.
Yeah? Yeah. Over here?
Hi there. Yeah, wonderful app. I just want to ask, have you profiled the sort of maximum number of windows that you can have, say, with an image and, you know, see that?
Yeah. So if you zoom very, very deeply, say like, I think currently it's like 15 to 20 boards, depending on how much is going on those boards. If you zoom very deep, then at some point your memory just builds up and you might crash. So we might either limit the level of depth at some point, or do things like I mentioned earlier, where you actually like you basically free stuff again that is up the hierarchy, and then as you go further up again, you might then like redraw those views, so to kind of keep a more tight handle on what's actually being rendered and loaded.
Cool, thank you.
Hi, I'm here.
Hi.
I just was wondering if you also considered like putting it in a more 3D space, or hooking it up with AR somehow. Like
I haven't actually tried to code anything, but it's definitely something on my list to consider. Like maybe like, you know, gaming engines are obviously often like very, very good at this like high load rendering things. So we might look into something like that in the future for the zooming interface for sure. Yeah. Do you see one more back there and one here?
Thank you. Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you. My question is, I'm just wondering, how do you handle persistence? Like, how do you, like, when someone closes the app and comes back, how do you remember where all the different things are in the drawings and everything?
Very good question. So currently we actually use Firebase for storing everything. It's a bit of a legacy thing because in the beginning we had like a Chrome extension where you could actually clip web content. So we needed to be able to authenticate users across devices. So actually everything currently goes into a Firebase backend. That is also has the local database, and it works kind of nicely. But we actually, for the sake of building this right from the ground up, we're probably going to rip that out very soon, and possibly just use core data to kind of have like the actual files stored flatly on your device, like PDFs and images and stuff, and then use core data to store all of the spatial and relational information. And then once we have that right, we might potentially look into having like cross-device support, maybe have a companion app for the iPad at some point. So then maybe we'll move back to Firebase, maybe we'll like roll our own backend. That's definitely still out in the open.
I guess last question. I first want to say that I would totally love to pay for this weird, messy prototype that you have.
We will gladly take your money.
So I really like this discussion that right now people are asking you questions and there's like kind of dialogue. I want to ask, like, do you use any networks for like kind of brainstorming ideas with other engineers, because you are exploring and you said that you're working with people that are you are the engineer, and so you can't bounce ideas.
This is actually this is something that has been a little bit hard for me, being like the single engineer on this project. Like notably, the people that I'm working on, that I'm working with on this, also have an engineering background. So they're not currently performing engineering roles on this project, but they're good sounding boards to like at least discuss through some of the architecture challenges. And then, so we're like a small team within this kind of bigger research lab. So there's also other people there to exchange ideas with. But I was actually the only iOS developer on like in the entire lab. So if I was running up to like very specific like iOS related things, like I could empathize very well with Shannon's talk on the first day, like this detangling gesture recognizers, like how to make it possible to like pinch and do this at the same time, and like this like whole multi-gesture thing is like very intricate like iOS specific problems. So I was pretty much left with like Google and Stack Overflow to bounce ideas. But yeah, hopefully we'll get some additional help on the engineering side soon, and that would be great. Sorry? Yeah. Let's all network. I would love to hear your ideas, for sure. Okay, I think that's it.
Yeah, I mean, like,
Thank you, yeah.